Hi there, and thank you for joining us for the difference between next generation science standards and curriculum. My name is Francis Vigent. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom. At KnowAtom, we really believe that science, technology, engineering, and math is the best context for developing students' higher order thinking skills. And by higher order thinking skills, what I mean is creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. And so what we love about the next generation science standards is really the way to go about that is putting students in the role of scientist and engineer. And of course that requires curriculum materials and professional development, but really it's the science standards which sort of give way to what comes after that. And so my background here is as a teacher, actually. Prior to KnowAtom, my role was as an elementary and middle school STEM specialist. So I taught elementary through middle school and then actually taught high school science prior to that. So I've had a bit of exposure to all these levels. I'm hoping if you're on the live session that you'll notice on the right side of your screen there is a space where you can enter questions. We do have about 1,000 folks who are enrolled and signed in here, so we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. But going forward, what I'd like to focus on is really 4 key areas. The next generation classroom experience, and the reason I'm bringing this into the conversation is that the next generation classroom experience is reflective of the standards, but it's really defined by curriculum. Next, we're going to take a look at how to differentiate between curriculum and standards, sort of unpacking what curriculum and standards are, promoting mastery of skills over task performance. So how is it that we go beyond taking or having students sort of focused on performing a task when they're asked, to having skills which really allow them to answer any problem or question the way that the next generation science standards have articulated it. And finally, what to look for when analyzing STEM task and curriculum, specifically how to approach structure given that we have a new structure of standards, which are performance expectations, and 5 key areas to look for. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in here. And so that we're all on the same page, to understand the next generation science standards, first and foremost, we have to understand that there's a new definition of effective STEM instruction. And this has to be reflected, so it's not only reflected in the standards, but it has to be reflected in curriculum. And this is the definition. It's not mine, but it actually comes from the National Research Council all the way back to 2011. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences, identifies and builds on what they know, and provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices, and that's a deliberate word, the practices of science, and sustain their interest. And so this definition is not only a shift in the purpose of the standards, going from something that are facts to be remembered and recalled that fit a traditional model of instruction, which you see on the left, to something that is really practice-based or skills-based, where students are in that role of scientist and engineer. The curriculum is building on what students know. It's intentionally nurturing, and the standards are designed that way to allow curriculum to scaffold September through June, but also from grade level to grade level. And that's why under these new standards, curriculum needs to shift away from the type of experience you see on the left, where something's pre-taught and students then mirror back what was shown to them. And pre-taught may be the wrong word. It's not necessarily just pre-taught, but something that is sort of delivered and then has to be mirrored back to something which you see on the right, where students have full ownership over something that's authentic and sort of new to them for the very first time. I want to focus in on this word practices for a moment, because the practices are a key element that is being added to the standards, which have never really been a part of the standards before. You may be sort of familiar with practices in terms of inquiry if your state has inquiry standards, but the practices under NGSS are very specific, and there's 8 of them here at a high level. Those practices have to be something that can be practiced in the context of curriculum, and we're going to unpack that more in a bit. But here they are asking questions, defining problems, not only carrying out investigations, but planning them beforehand, arguing from evidence. Okay, these are all things that students need to internalize and be able to demonstrate in a context. Okay, so this is a dimension of the new standards. And so when you look at these pictures that I'm showing you, I'd like to give you some sort of a mental picture of what practices and what next generation classrooms will start to look like as we shift from this traditional model to a next generation model. When students are allowed to take on the role of scientist and engineer, they actually use the practice, or the practices, to access content. They're developing and using the content as they authentically answer questions and solve problems. So the curriculum creates the context that students are actually going to carry out these practices and processes, but the standards require it, because the standards are going to expect students to demonstrate their understanding. And so this next type of next generation inquiry can happen anywhere and at any age, but we have to recognize that it's going to look and sort of feel differently. So whether it's an urban environment or suburban environment or a rural environment, or even an environment like this, where it's perhaps one of the most challenging environments that we've ever dealt with here at KnowAtom, where students are learning next generation science standards in through KnowAtom material in IDP camps, or refugee camps, in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. And I like to bring this picture up often because it reminds me that, you know, even at a high level, when you look at these pictures, you can see students who are all engaged in a similar way as scientists and engineers. You can see the full release of responsibility, and even in these environments, which are very harsh, students can use their higher order thinking skill, develop the practices, engage in the context, and authentically be those scientists and engineers. And that's why when we think about the standards, it's really helpful to think about students as scientists and engineers. The new standards are helping provide purpose for curriculum. That's a key difference here. The next generation science standards are the purpose of the curriculum. So if the curriculum is doing something that has no purpose in the standards, you really have to ask why. Now, curriculum will go beyond the standards to make connections and sometimes introduce and reinforce and so on. But again, just like these pictures that you're seeing, students are engaged scientists and engineers. It's not just building and making and doing things. It's very purposeful. Each of these students is engaged in trying to solve a problem or answer a question using their skills. And so whatever they're creating is yielding data, which they then analyze and form conclusions with and share out as part of that sort of next generation inquiry environment. So in this case, sharing their team's findings, maybe it's in an engineering context, so we can think of that as, you know, we developed this prototype, here's how it solved the problem, we know it solved the problem because we were able to test it, gather this data, and then other teams saying, well, you know, we did something similar, but it was different in this way, and we had different results. You know, here's how and why. And so that is really the next generation science standards coming alive in a classroom through curriculum. And so what I'd like to do now is really think about the idea that the next generation science standards are reflected in that STEM learning environment through 3 channels, basically: curriculum, professional development, and materials, which we have to recognize they have to merge in such a way that they share the same purpose and they support that environment of teaching and learning, okay, that is emanating from the standards. And so that gets us to the question of how do we differentiate between next generation science standards and curriculum. So I want to really unpack this. So kind of using that mental imagery. Next generation science standards merely define the minimum performance expectation of a student who has an understanding of what they should have learned according to the standard. So think about it like a new driver taking their driver's test. The examiner may ask the student to take a left turn and parallel park anywhere they'd like. The context of that driving exam happens to be a geographical location where it's taking place. It's where they are at in the moment. However, by kind of appropriately performing that examiner's expectations, as they drive down the road, the state can have reasonable confidence that the new driver has met the performance expectations. They have skills and the understanding that they can apply in many other contexts. Okay, so the context is central here. The standards merely are the expectations for performance. They are not the context. See, the context changes. And so when we think about kind of unpacking the standards here, the standards apply in almost an infinite number of contexts, and they actually interact and connect with many other standards by virtue of the way they were designed. So it's not, the next generation science standards are not focused on isolated concepts and isolated content. They're really focused on performance expectations. So to call them standards is a little bit of an inaccuracy, really, because this next generation science standards are what students are expected to be able to demonstrate as a result of what they have learned and experienced in the classroom. Okay, that means that they require mastery of the skills specific to science and engineering, which are those practices, the 8 practices that we talked about. Those have to be internalized. It also requires understanding the disciplinary core ideas, which sort of traditionally we think of as content. The content under the next generation science standards is different. It's connected. Okay, it's not sort of isolated facts, but it's content that's more dynamic. So we'll take a look at that in a second, but you'll see what I mean. And also, students are going to have to demonstrate performance, which requires understanding the relationship between pieces of that content, specifically that as students see how the content interacts and connects, that they're able to gain a grasp of sort of the systems thinking dimension, which next generation science standards calls cross-cutting concepts. So think about this in the sense that as a student is participating as a scientist or engineer, using skills and experiencing, developing, and using content, they're going to be seeing that content connecting and interacting with other areas of content. And that's why it's really important to realize that the standards, just like those state and federal driving regulations, are determining how, the state and federal driving regulations determine how we can behave on the road. They don't tell us where to drive. Next generation science standards tell us how to teach science and engineering authentically, so that it's focused on the skills, and so that it leads to students being able to perform an expectation. But they don't tell us what to teach, nor do they define or represent a specific task. And that's really important to recognize, that the next generation science standards, when you look at them, are not tasks, and they're not telling us how to teach. What to teach. They're telling us how to teach. And so let's look at the way these are constructed. When we see the next generation science standards, the way you see here on your screen, they're performance expectations, which you see in white, reflected in 3 dimensions, which are the 3 colored boxes below. If you look at a particular standard like this, which is saying students who demonstrate understanding can develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of a sort of traditional model of science instruction to see this performance expectation as a task, where you might take each of the words and make it into a vocabulary list and pre-teach that, and then explain to the students and show them explain to them what a food chain is, show them a food chain, and then have them make a food chain. That's a traditional model. And so what I've just described is mistaking this performance expectation for a task, and also mistaking it for curriculum. Because remember, developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment applies in an infinite number of different contexts. And so that's something that the Next Generation Science Standards really kind of positions for us as a place where we can design curriculum to, represent that performance expectation in the context of a marine ecosystem or a deciduous forest or a tundra. There's a parking lot even. There's so many different contexts where that could come alive that to sort of pigeonhole it into a task is misrepresenting it. And the reason that so many folks get sort of stuck there is really this visual that shows a traditional model of STEM instruction that I just described. And you can see here how the content is flowing through the teacher, who is acting as sort of a content expert and distributor of knowledge, and the teacher's modeling facts, demonstrating tasks, and explaining what. So this is sort of the traditional way that most people are taught to teach, and the way that the standards that have existed by and large, unless you're from a state with inquiry standards, have allowed. And of course, to show that students have learned, their job in this case is to repeat, recall, mirror back what they've seen or heard. And so at best, this model that we've had traditionally gets at performance, really task performance, and that's sort of its highest level. So that begs the question then that, well, first, what is curriculum if the standards are just sort of giving us the rules of the road? And what is a next generation model of instruction that's sort of behind what we're seeing in some of those pictures? Well, curriculum defines a specific context where students develop and use multiple standards and concepts and practices from those three dimensions. And in the sort of driving test analogy, curriculum creates the perfect neighborhood or series of neighborhoods, in a sense, for developing and using proficiency. So we're not removing reality, but what we're doing is that we're creating a context, or sort of immersing students in the reality of being a scientist and engineer in a specific context, such that it presents an increasing and really diverse set of challenges. And those challenges are coming from the three dimensions. So it's the content, the skills, and the sort of interaction of content, that cross-cutting concept. So this is why Next Generation Science curriculum in any given moment is really kind of one large context, and it allows students to be able to develop and use those engineering skills, those practices, the content, which the Next Generation Science Standards calls disciplinary core ideas, and the dynamic relationships that sort of uncover them, which are the cross-cutting concepts. When you think about Next Generation Science curriculum, you have to realize that under the previous standards and under that traditional model of instruction, a once-and-done approach was okay, in a sense, because really the standards were isolating ideas, right? And a once-and-done idea really is never okay, but you could kind of get away with it because it was really just having to remember facts. Now, if you're from a state that has inquiry standards, you know that remembering facts in the context of inquiry just doesn't cut it, because inquiry is a set of skills, and these Next Generation Science standards as performance expectations are bringing skills in through that dimension of science and engineering practices. So thinking about standards and how they relate to curriculum, curriculum has to build skills and content knowledge, scaffolding from September through June. And from the definition of effective STEM instruction, we know that engaging students early in the practices of science and intentionally building on what they know is at the core, this sort of nurturing idea that we're going to develop skills and then use them over and over again in lots of different contexts. We're going to develop content knowledge, and we're going to use it over and over again by connecting it to other content knowledge that we encounter. And we're going to see patterns in the way content behaves, and we're going to see similar patterns in lots of different areas of content. So curriculum is creating these sort of content contexts that evolve through the year and really build from pre-K through 12th grade, in addition to just sort of that September through June model. So at a high level, this is an example of how we at KnowAtom use the standards and reflect them in curriculum to kind of create a scaffold from September through June in unit structure. And in this case, I'm showing you our grades 6 through 8. So it's just a segment, but you can see just here how the strands, so that earth science, life science, technology applications of science and engineering, is never once and done. And actually I could extend this all the way down to first grade, kindergarten, and so on. And you could see how it's intentionally building from one grade level to the next. But at the same time, these are specific units that happen in a specific order. And no matter what curriculum, it has to take into account the user experience for students and teachers, because real mastery comes as concepts and contexts evolve and they connect. And that's what's happening here. And you can even see that at a really high level, the idea that everything's made of matter, that we live here in a specific place in space, and our home being Earth has unique characteristics which allow for life. And that life has specific structure and function and forms ecosystems which transfer energy and use energy, and even in non-living settings we have energy transformations and these same sort of concepts of matter coming together. So, feeding into engineering and even sort of the implications of engineering for how societies come together and develop over time, you have really a really big picture, sort of a year-long conversation that's also sort of developing over time. So scaffolding and really thoughtful concepts and vocabulary and context is the role of curriculum, okay? And really specifically supporting teachers to be able to link up with their peers, to be able to teach as a team, whether they're in the same building or not, and to move students to understanding at proficient and advanced levels. So we've talked about sort of the what and the why, or sort of the what and the how that comes from standards, and curriculum being really the how side of that. But why do we need next generation science standards, or why were they even developed? Well, if the how of performance, sort of the how is the performance expectations from the standards, and the what is the context that curriculum gives us, the reason that standards were developed was going back a decade or even longer. Research and concern came from industry, and it came through the National Research Council and the National Academies of Science and Engineering, which did a whole bunch of studies on K-12 STEM education with the purpose of understanding, first of all, what's happening, and second of all, trying to understand why more students weren't ready to take on STEM careers. They weren't necessarily trainable. They didn't come out with the skills necessary, and they also didn't have the skills to take on STEM degrees if they wanted to really go full tilt into science, technology, engineering, or math. And so these studies made it evident that science standards that were in place across the U.S. in instruction as a result, because again, standards tell us how to teach and curriculum tells us what to teach, and so that curriculum is either something we're purchasing or putting together through many different resources or creating ourselves. All of that ended up aimed primarily at teaching the history of what was discovered by scientists and the solutions that were designed by engineers. So it was really focused on both lower order thinking skills and nothing to really do with being a scientist or engineer, nothing to do with developing and using the discipline. So aside from the few states with basic inquiry skills, which also, even in those states, often siloed them in their own sort of strand, there was no focus on teaching K-12 students skills specific to the disciplines. And so that's why these next generation science standards have emerged. And when you look at this graphic, the next generation science standards rearrange that traditional Bloom's taxonomy so that creating, evaluating, and analyzing really are happening simultaneously in the learning environment, because remembering, understanding, and applying isn't enough anymore. Okay, that idea of students, when we picture students like this, you know, they're taking on that role, and in taking on the role of engineer or scientist, they have to take the background that they've gained through some nonfiction reading or Socratic dialogue, the connections they've made in that dialogue, and actually approach a problem or question. They are creating, evaluating, and analyzing their own thinking. So it also has sort of a metacognitive dimension to it as well. So this is what that next generation model of STEM instruction looks like. So the next generation model is different than the traditional model. Remember, the traditional model, the content comes through the teacher sort of hands it out as the expert, and then the student then sort of shows that they can hand it back, right, recall it. The next generation model is really a model where the teacher tunes the inquiry environment. Okay, that's the teacher's role, to act as a coach. Hopefully you're getting a sense that this next generation model is significantly different than that traditional model, and it's because the three dimensions come to life. Okay, the practices are coming to life, the content is going to come to life, and in order for that to happen, students have to internalize those science and engineering practice skills. Okay, so that's why you see the students and the practice skills together over there. The teacher's going to adjust supports for that. They're going to help the student understand how to engage appropriately as a scientist or engineer. They're going to be redirecting and monitoring. They're really acting as a co-chair. The student is going to take that, and they're directly engaging with the content, those disciplinary core ideas, the concepts, and they're using their practice skills to develop and extend their understanding and also uncover sort of the behavior of this content, how it relates to other concepts. So the student's job isn't to hand back what a teacher handed them, because the teacher's not handing them anything at this point. The teacher's coaching them along and supporting. The student has to take on the role, actually develop and use the content with these skills that they're developing, and really be able to engage in or engage, to just get on the bike and engage in problem solving and answering questions, and then to be able to use system behavior, sort of like the inputs, outputs, and identifying things as cycles and so on, to describe the interaction between the different concepts that they're seeing. So this is very different, and I apologize if I'm going kind of quickly through these because I know it's complex, but at the same time, it's important that we really sort of look at this from multiple angles and how it manifests itself, because the next generation science standards are really redefining in a lot of ways what we traditionally think of as teaching science. Okay, teaching science isn't telling kids about what scientists have done. Teaching science in a next generation model like this is creating an environment where students can be scientists and engineers and interact with the different dimensions that the next generation science standards have put forward. And in that environment, that context that the curriculum has to create, because that's the job of the curriculum now, is creating that context, creating supports for the teacher and a path through content and concepts for those students in different lessons, so that they're interacting, they're developing, they're using, and then able to then perform the expectations which the next generation science standards will require them to perform when the next generation of assessments come forward. But beyond assessments, really it's preparing students to be trainable as folks in the workforce. And again, thinking about these higher order thinking skills, it's putting students in a strong position to be able to engage as salespeople, as accountants, as scientists or engineers if they want, but really it's those skills coming from ownership and participation in this kind of STEM cycle that the standards give us. Okay, so again, next generation science standards, by defining what we teach, the sort of the rules of the road, in essence, is giving us the rules of what science and engineering is, and that scientists are asking questions and developing hypotheses and carrying out experiments to gather data and form conclusions and grow that body of scientific knowledge. So students are participating in that in the classroom, actually developing those skills. They're also using that knowledge and participating in engineering, because we know that through the standards, because they've told us that engineers solve problems, they identify and solve problems, and they do that by developing prototypes, testing them, gathering data, and forming conclusions about them, whether they would refine or replicate it as, you know, full-scale technology. And so this is very different, and it's not that old traditional model of sort of isolated instruction and isolated concepts, and math being at the center because it helps us really quantify and communicate, because math is a language, and it's a language to be able to replicate and articulate your own ideas, but also those of others. The challenge right now with analyzing curriculum and tasks is that most resources you'll find are a re-articulation of something that isn't aimed at the next generation science standards. And you know, as we've been around for the last 10 years developing curriculum and really watching this process and I guess going all in on next generation science standards, by taking the suggestions of these reports as they were coming out in 2010 and 11 and so on, right down to the standards that exist now, and putting them into practice in the classroom, these are things that are just really great for kids. They're great for instruction, but the problem is that most of the resources that are out there are taking a very isolated approach. And so I want to think about student readiness levels as a way of kind of thinking about, one, what we're going for under next generation science standards, what the expectation of the standards are, how curriculum and resources then reflect that. So awareness readiness being sort of the most basic level. Awareness ready resources are the kind of resources you get from museums. They're the kind of resources you get from other, you know, sort of field trip providers. They are the kind of resources you get from companies who engage in science and technology related activity. And the goal of an awareness-ready resource is to literally make students aware of sort of the basic aspects of, one, you know, what is a scientist? Two, what is an engineer? How does XYZ company actually use a specific you know, concept from science, or how do they use their knowledge of science to make something? So again, as a result of that, students aren't going to be ready to be scientists or engineers. They haven't developed a specific set of skills and proficiency with practices, but you know, the light is on, and they can raise their hand and say, I know what a scientist or engineer is. I can say, you know, the science behind, I mean, that's a real dead giveaway, the science behind something, you know, kind of connect what's been done. And then that's where the point starts to transition towards this knowledge readiness. So knowledge readiness is really things that we think about textbooks are being, textbooks have traditionally been very good at telling us all about what scientists have discovered and engineers have created. And so taking it beyond readiness of being able to say, yeah, that's a scientist, that's an engineer, and, you know, that's the science behind this, that more broad-based knowledge, you think about sort of textbooks and sort of the history of what's been discovered. Going beyond that, we sort of think about performance readiness and these kind of, you know, I remember as a teacher, you know, these plastic boxes of kit materials that we have all used for 100 years, and you know, or the speckled black and white boxes of cardboard boxes of materials that really, you know, they may be hands-on, but they allow us or sort of equip us to get students thinking about carrying out a specific task when it's required of them. So when they're asked about the hardness of a rock or mineral, they know to carry out the task correctly of scratching that rock or mineral on these different surfaces, and they can come back with a number of 1 or 2 or something like this. So that's performance readiness, and performance readiness, is really performance ready for a specific task or a specific context. Mastery readiness is really aimed at developing skills which are transferable and which are useful for answering any problem or solving any problem or answering any question. And so how might that play out? And if you're from a state that is participating in the PARCC assessments, you may have already seen this, or even Smarter Balance, where in ELA context, students are being sent on sort of these performance quests to find support from text to back up their claims and so on. Well, I don't want to draw a parallel between PARCC assessments and next generation science, because there's no connection other than they're both trying to get a performance of specific expectations and skills. Mastery readiness is going to take the form, or really takes the form of students being able to take a skill and go into a context and use that skill to arrive at a conclusion, really create, evaluate, and analyze the context in light of what's been given to them. Okay, and I'll give you an example. Let's say, and so for mastery readiness, so let's say that a student is given the context of other students who've gone through the library and come across some data, 2 different charts. And one chart is of the amount of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, and the other chart has to do with the temperature of Earth. And both are over the same time period. And this fictitious student may say, well, you know what, by looking at these 2 graphs, you can see that increases in carbon dioxide result in increases in temperature in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, the student who's proficient as a result of classroom instruction has mastered science and engineering practice skills should be able to look at that and either say, yeah, this data does support that conclusion, or be able to find holes in that and say, actually, this data does not support that conclusion. Here's why. And so a student emerging from this next generation science environment really should be able to look at that 2 sets of data and say, you know what, actually, when you look at this time period, the amount of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere actually declines, and in the same time period, the temperature increases. So it's not always the case. There may be some other factors. Now, I'm not using this example to make any statements about the relationship between carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature rising or anything like this. What I'm merely trying to point out here is that the skill specific to the discipline is being able to go in and think critically, to be able to look at what's being posed and find a problem or ask a question about it, and be able to use the data available to validate someone else's ideas as well as somebody's own ideas, and also to bring new ideas forward. And one example of that would be something like a student then saying, we have to make sure that there aren't other factors involved in this. For instance, could the amount of energy coming from the sun be increasing? Okay, or could there be perhaps other gases in the Earth's atmosphere that are increasing, or so on? So mastery readiness is really about taking the skills beyond performance of a specific task and into a place where you can go into any context and use those skills to consider it and to come to your own conclusions. And that's why promoting mastery of skills over task performance is so important. And that begs the question, well, how do you create curriculum for the next generation science standards if the next generation science standards are really aiming at these skills, so that it's mastery of skills and not just sort of the ability to perform a specific task on request? So here's how we at KnowAtom have kind of approached this development of curriculum over the years as all this next generation sort of science standard drafts have been coming out and finalized and so on, and we've been putting that into classrooms and then seeing really large data gains as a result. Some of them even, I think last year we saw one school in an urban environment that added 39 points to their proficient and advanced scoring students on the state standardized testing. So, upwards of that level, but nonetheless, how do you get there from the standards when you're creating curriculum? Here's how we've approached that. So one, and again, remember that these lessons take place over multiple days. It's starting with that nonfiction reading that's purposeful, really targeted, uses the concepts and context, the vocabulary and so on, and then transitioning into that Socratic dialogue. Then student teams carrying out really or creating plans for investigations where they're taking the concepts and actually using them to plan. And the Socratic dialogue, again, really linking the concepts to context and the student's own experience. And then students carrying out their own plans. So again, they're in this role of scientist and engineer. As a result of carrying out their plan, they're going to gather data which they can then form conclusions, share it with the class, compare their approach, their ideas, their outcomes, and debrief. So that's really what the curriculum is doing to create a context where the students can be scientists and engineers and then move through from September through June through many different contexts and from first grade through 8th grade. So I'm going to go through the next few slides rather quickly where I actually show you what this looks like from a teacher's perspective, both the teacher's perspective and a student's perspective in the form of curriculum and resources. If you want to see anything closer, you can just go on KnowAtom.com, click, there's a top link, STEM curriculum, and you can download any of these things. So one, using that nonfiction reading to establish background knowledge, we do that in the reader, and then you can see it's broken down into sections. Those sections then link to specific lessons, so lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. And it's written in such a way that it is a narrative, almost like a newspaper article, and this is the 7th grade level one that I'm just taking screenshots here, but you can see that students are actually engaging the text features, the vocabulary, and the concepts as it's sort of being unfolded in a realistic context, bringing those Common Core ELA connections to life when appropriate, and also focusing on specific vocabulary that links to the concepts and then scaffolds over time. Okay, and by breaking it down on a unit-by-unit basis, and in our case, we focus sort of monthly themes, so there's sort of these themes that build over time, and they, at their smallest unit level, are a month. Students are reading, even at a 4th grade level, probably 220 to 300 pages a year of nonfiction reading, but it's just in these short chunks, these 3- and 5-page chunks, which are really manageable. And so that nonfiction reading then leads into Socratic dialogue where we activate learning. Okay, so thinking about curriculum, if you're going to take those next generation science standards and have them reflected in your curriculum has to create an authentic environment for the students to engage, and that's really what Socratic dialogue does well and why we use it. So if you're not familiar with the Socratic dialogue, it's a method of asking higher order questions that cause students to use higher order thinking skills, to really consider the connections between the different concepts, so the concepts aren't in isolation, and respond, because we're going to be asking higher order questions, the students are going to have to respond with higher order thinking, creating, evaluating, and analytical type answers. And it's important to note, like, while you see here, it's easy to say, oh, that's a teacher in front of a classroom, we have that. Well, in this case, the teacher is the moderator and the coach. Remember, they're not delivering the content in that traditional model. They're facilitating questioning and really requiring the students to consider and respond as the scientist or engineer. And that's where we sort of take that re-articulation of Bloom's taxonomy, and we can really see it in the types of questions we ask. So if you look at question 4, 5, or 6, you can see that in order for a student to respond to this style question, it requires them to engage in higher order thinking, whether it's analyzing, evaluating, or creating. Going beyond that discussion where we connect, we actually have to plan. And so beginning in 4th grade, we have students really planning in blank composition notebooks. And prior to that, and I'll show you that to you later, students are working with templates. But again, there's a purposeful planning because we're not just doing something hands-on, we're actually carrying out our plan in a hands-on way. And so students are creating that plan in that environment. And really, as we think about the next generation model of instruction, we're engaging across disciplines. So again, not isolating concepts and even isolating science in and of itself. When you think of students planning, they're engaging ELA and math standards as well. Okay, specifically Common Core ELA math practices, Common Core math practices, and Common Core technical ELA standards. The only things that are really just science is the experimenting and prototyping itself. And so this is a middle school lab, but you can see that reflected here where a student would be creating a lab. And so, you know, how do you approach a question? You use a scientific process. How do you approach a problem? You use an engineering design process. And so as you're carrying out that process, you're creating really an ELA nonfiction text, which is a plan, which at some point where I've circled here, you begin to carry out, gather data, form a conclusion. Okay, and I'm not going to get into it much now, but just so you can see the crossover, Common Core ELA technical subject standards, and these are from middle school. You can see where they relate, using evidence to support analysis, expressing information visually, distinguishing among facts, reasoned judgment, and so on. Common Core math practices really, again, mirror the science and engineering practices where students are required to make sense of problems, construct viable arguments, attend to precision, reason abstractly. Again, that's a reason why we create the plan first and then carry the plan out. That's abstract reasoning. If you do something and then make a plan, well, that's not really planning, that's journaling. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you want to take a look at any of those units, you can, and then sort of kind of unpack that in light of what we've discussed with the role of content having to create a context here and that sort of 5-stage process. What to look for when analyzing STEM tasks and curriculum, and I'm going to try to wrap up here and save time for questions. I want to show you how we've approached really structuring this on the back end for teachers. So in its most basic form, what to look for in tasks when analyzing, for its sort of STEM value or purpose. At its most basic, when you look at these pictures, what you see is planning, and it's authentic planning. This pair of students is going to have a different plan than the pair of students in the background behind them and the ones next to them and so on. All the plans are different, yet they're still approaching a generally common question or a common question or problem. The next piece is that students are carrying out those plans. So all of what they're carrying out is authentic to their thoughts and ideas. Doesn't mean that there wasn't intervention by the teacher to help redirect or monitor or make sure that they're meeting minimum expectations. But really, there's diversity here. Diversity not only in the planning, but in the actual results of those plans, in the prototypes and the data and the conclusions. Okay, and that's why you should be looking for not only something, okay, hands-on, fine, but the purpose of the hands-on stuff is to carry out the plan. The purpose of the plan is to gather data. And so when you gather the data, you have to analyze it. And when you analyze it, you're going to come to some conclusion, and that's what students need to be doing as well. Presenting and evaluating claims. So again, thinking about these next generation science standards requiring students to have internalized these practice skills, one of those has to do with argumentation from evidence. If you are forming conclusions and not actually sharing those out and having the diversity in the classroom such that the claims are bringing different pieces to the table and students can consider their results and how they're different than their neighboring teams' results and different approaches and seeing patterns and efficiencies, then you're kind of leaving yourself at a loss there. The back-end side, so from a teacher's perspective, this requires a really supportive curriculum. So a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of curriculum and a classroom experience at a higher level and sort of the general way that we structure it. Very specifically, I want to show you how we've approached it, at least here at KnowAtom, for teachers to support them. And so I'm going to move quickly through these slides too. This is all stuff you can download at knowatom.com. But the teacher needs to know where they're going. They need to understand what standards, objectives, and lessons, what units do in what order, and so on. And so that's why we have specific progressions and breakdowns of units, objectives, and overviews. Furthermore, the teacher needs to understand how the lessons address performance expectations in 3 dimensions. So you can see within that unit that we're actually unpacking each of the standards by dimension so they understand how not only the unit is bringing the standards to life, but specifically how the lessons are. And not only in the practices dimension, but also in the disciplinary core ideas dimension and in the cross-cutting concept dimension. We're making sure that the student reading that we saw earlier is bringing concepts and vocabulary alive, which is directly related to the concepts or is exactly the same really as the vocabulary that the teacher is using. So that scaffolding vocabulary is important and reflected in the curriculum for the teacher as well. As these next generation science standards are going into adoption, it's important that whether somebody's new to teaching entirely and maybe lack background knowledge, having never taught any of the material before, or whether a veteran teacher has a lot of background knowledge in some areas but hasn't had to teach other areas of science or engineering, that there's support there. So the way we approach that is making sure that the support is there for the teacher at an adult's level, basically taking what's in that student's reader and building it out for the teacher so that they, first and foremost, understand the concepts and the context themselves, but second of all, that it actually feeds that Socratic dialogue and helps them to have a really informed conversation in such a way that the students and teachers are on the same page. And that common language is so important, because if a student goes between classrooms and they get a different definition of what science and engineering is, then what use is it really? The student, as a user of the curriculum and the instruction, just gets confused. So that consistency in curriculum is really important. And lesson objectives and materials, so thinking about, well, what lessons do I carry out, what materials do I need, what's the objective, making sure that there's preparation notes and sort of ways of getting that teacher going with discussion, supporting the Socratic dialogue, the visuals, and block planning if there's places where there may be blocks of different sizes. Maybe you have an hour one day, an hour and a half another day, or even at an elementary level, whether you have an hour twice a week or something like that, that the curriculum is accounting for that. And then in terms of carrying out the lesson itself from a hands-on perspective and a planning perspective, giving the teachers enough support so that they can guide the lesson, but it's important that we recognize that the full release of responsibility is where students need to be at. So having the guidance there for the teachers so they can see where they're going is important, but teachers shouldn't be using that, to guide students all year long. Really, we're talking about the first, 8 to 10 weeks where there's some guidance going on, and they're removing those supports. Because remember, if a teacher is guiding or facilitating all year long, then that's just a different form of that traditional instructional model where, the teacher's delivering the content. And the same thing with these programs that you've probably run across where there's like, make by number, or pictures of how to do things, or instructions that you hand the student. That is not engaging in the practices or processes. What it is it's removing that, it's taking control over it, and from an adult perspective, and then the students actually aren't being scientists and engineers. They're just, giving back what was expected of them to use the procedure and put the materials together. Okay, so not too helpful. So here you see that exemplar for a teacher. Every student's lab is going to look differently, at least every student team. In a team, the students have to agree. But after that problem or question has sort of kind of come together in the class, everything after that is going to vary. The students are going to be identifying different facts that are relevant to the problem or the question, different materials that are needed, different potential solutions, and choosing to prototype them differently or so on. So everything is going to kind of change. And so without going into it further, there are a lot of, this is where professional development comes in, because the curriculum is structuring things this way. Professional development has to map the teacher's existing skill sets over so they understand how to release responsibility and how also to be able to to make this authentic for the students without sort of taking that control. And also how to look at a whole bunch of sort of different labs and different outcomes and understand, is the student meeting expectations or not. So things like labs are assessments. They're formative, they're summative, but there's other assessments too, like vocabulary checks. And this is one of our vocabulary checks here, which, they take the form of homework or tickets to leave or things like that. They're summative, but well-designed curriculum is going to take this vocabulary and make it part of a much larger conversation. Same thing with concepts, require having assessments where students have to synthesize in a new context, take what they've learned and really demonstrate it. And as we kind of go towards these next generation assessments on a not on a national level, but nationally, as we individually as states adopt different next generation assessments to reflect the new standards, we're going to be seeing more and more of these contexts where students are being asked questions that require that critical thinking, the mastery of skills to be reflected. And so for teachers, keeping it in mind that detailed answer keys, why something is the answer and why other options were not the answer, are important. Supporting ELA and math connections is important. Differentiating instruction and actually showing teachers how concepts map is really important. So we are almost up on time, but what I'm going to do is give you the 5 key things to look for and then take questions. I'm also going to give you my contact information. If you can't stay, you're welcome to send a question by email. I'll do my best to get back to you with that if I, again, can't get to all the questions. So 5 key things to look for when analyzing STEM tasks. First and foremost, and this goes for curriculum too, clearly connected purpose. And that purpose comes from the standard. So if what you're doing is not clearly connecting to the 3 dimensions of next generation science standards, then and specifically putting the student in a position where they have to answer a question or solve a problem, even like you see on the left here, this is grade 3 level. What you see on the left is grade 3. The students have ownership over these pieces, and they see the purpose, and they're participating in the purpose. There's some of it's been removed because we can't fit it on the screen, but nonetheless, they are clearly connected to the purpose of the investigation, which comes from the purpose given to us by the standards and those 3 dimensions. And then as the students progress to 4th grade or so on, which you see here on the right, the same purpose is there, but now it's taking a different form as well. The second thing is 90% reliance on the students. You want to be looking for almost 100% reliance on the students as you're releasing this responsibility, such that they are creating, evaluating, and analyzing. And those Socratic classrooms is where it starts. That Socratic seminar is where it starts. Okay. Again, remembering that we're coaching and not delivering the content unilaterally. The third piece is engagement in 3 dimensions, sort of simultaneously. Okay, we're not isolating. Okay, we're going to learn now is this practice, and then we're going to later learn a different practice. No, they happen simultaneously, and in fact, they happen in the context of the content, and that's what reveals these different sort of cross-cutting concepts and which are the relationships between the content. So that's what you see here in these different pictures. Students aren't just using isolated concepts. They aren't just using isolated practices. The 3 dimensions are happening simultaneously. Okay. And it's relying on them as well to sort of pull it forward. The 4th is looking for year-long conversation. So you know, science education has evolved into this world of supplements. Everything's a supplement. It's like this falling apart patchwork of a million different things that come from a million different sources. None of them actually agree, but you know, we kind of patch them together and then we try to make it work in the classroom as teachers. That doesn't work well, and it doesn't lend itself to a year-long conversation. What I mean by that is the idea that as you progress from one unit to the next or one lesson to the next, that we have scaffolding concepts, scaffolding vocabulary, and that we're building a big picture of what science and engineering is. And so concepts are connecting. They are not in isolation. As we're having the discussions, concepts from the first unit are coming up when we're in our fifth unit or third unit or so on. Okay? No more concepts in isolation. Instead, building these logical connections by thinking, discussing, and practicing together. And also with that full release responsibility as they're in the students are in teams. The final thing before I grab questions here is grouping standards and concepts. You have to be grouping standards and concepts. They're not isolated. That's why when I showed you that page from our curriculum and you see these different standards and they are coming alive in, you know, so multiple standards are coming alive in the same lesson or the same unit, the standards interact, the concepts interact, they aren't isolated. If you treat them as isolated, not only are your performance numbers on standardized testing going to be not too good, they're also students' grasp of what science and engineering is and what each of these disciplines are and their ability to perform the expectations is going to suffer. Okay, so the 5 things: purpose, release of responsibility to students, engagement of all 3 dimensions, a year-long conversation that evolves thinking and connections over multiple contexts as they change, and group standards and concepts. Here's my information, and I'm going to take questions now. I think we have probably a bunch of questions I can look at. Feel free, email is the best way to get a hold of me. Again, I'm Francis Vigent. I'm the CEO here, but I'm also a co-founder. So after 10 years of KnowAtom, if you have any questions, I'm happy to let you know what our experience has been. If you have a question about a resource you've downloaded or so on, or you're welcome to reach out to Mary Ellen. Feel free to grab that. My email address is fvigent, F-V-I-G-E-A-N-T, @knowatom.com, K-N-O-W-A-T-O-M.com. And while you're dropping your questions in, and I'll hang around for about 15 minutes here for questions, I'd like to let you know we covered an awful lot of material today, so moving a bit quicker, actually a lot quicker than normal, but all of our different resources are available for free online when it comes to webinars, ebooks, and things like that. You can access our fall webinar series here by going to info.knowatom.com/upcoming events, where any of our past events are now available on demand. Live events are ones you can register for, and if you register for something and can't make the actual live event, we will follow up with you, send you a link to the recording of that. And this is updated on a regular basis. One of our future webinars that's not up here is we are going to take administrators on a learning walk and really help explain how to do a learning walk as it relates to science, and use a continuum of practice rubric that's been developed by a number of schools and organizations, which really help to focus effective instruction for this next generation inquiry environment. So with that said, I'm going to just jump over to questions here. And if you just give me one moment. So if you are in a time zone, and I apologize, we have folks in the United Arab Emirates and Hawaii and elsewhere around the world. If you have an issue or had an issue with time, the time change, we are going to follow up, send you a link to this recording, the recording of this webinar, and you'll be welcome to watch that anytime it's convenient for you. If you do have questions at that point, again, you can feel free to reach out, even if it's an on-demand Some folks have asked about slides being available. The recording will be available, and you're welcome to grab the slides there. If you have a really specific use case, feel free to reach out. We'll do the best we can for you there. A number of folks mentioned that they enjoyed the time. Thank you. I appreciate that. We did have a lot of content to cover. Another question here has to do with the website and downloading resources. If both in the same resource bank, so if you go to KnowAtom.com and you look at science curriculum, that science curriculum link, when you download, let's say, 1st grade or 8th grade or so on, it will take you to both the reader and the curriculum. So the reader or lab manual is that student piece. So that's the student's piece of the curriculum. It's that nonfiction text which links to and really directly reflects what's in the teacher's piece. It's just that the teacher's piece is at the adult level. And so you'll be able to see how the teacher's piece is constructed, and you can do what you will. Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, so please feel free to learn from those resources. You can also subscribe to our blog. We put a lot of information out through there as sort of the next generation science standards are emerging. New developments and resources become available. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook is another way to connect. If you are interested, we don't unfortunately sell curriculum directly to teachers or materials or professional development. We do have free professional development online, which you can access through the resource section or some of these different webinars. We'll give a certificate of participation if you can prove that you've seen it, and so we'll ask you to provide your email address and name and so on. The materials and curriculum is only something that can be purchased by a school or a district. So if you are part of a curriculum committee, or if you are part of that leadership team, and you're thinking about the next generation science standards, and this is something that you feel fits well with what you'd like to accomplish, you're welcome to reach out to us. You can reach out to me, or Mary Ellen is more directly the one to speak with about that. She has a lot of information about all of that and can get you what you need. If there are any other questions, I'm surprised with this many folks in the room. We have only a few questions here. Some folks have asked what's available for on-site professional development for science instructors. So the way that we approach science professional development is really to work with the particular school or district, and it really depends on what level the adoption is happening. So everybody's kind of in the same boat right now. The next generation science standards are being implemented as we speak. Some states are in that implementation point right now. Some are required to be in it for September. And so everybody's kind of in between one of these, and others are going to be sort of embarking on it in September for the following year. Regardless, if it's being adopted on a building level, generally what we do is we work with the administrators to talk with the teachers, and also really specifically with the principal, to understand what is the past history of professional development in the district, and then have sort of match the implementation strategy to what professional development has happened. Now, let's say there's no professional development that's happened in the district around science. That's okay. What we do is the most basic form is that we do an implementation professional development session where we bring the team of teachers together, and it depends how many teachers again, and also what grade levels are being covered. Sometimes we'll break that into specific grade levels or age or grade spans, and we go through really mapping skill sets over, going through how to have a Socratic dialogue, really what the next generation practices and processes are, really kind of digging into the 3 dimensions, and further digging into the resources, because again, professional development in the context of implementing KnowAtom really has to do with how, what resources are available and how to use them, and how to release responsibility in an appropriate manner, and sort of the best, not only best practices, but what to expect, because this is a process, and any implementation or adoption is a process for that school or district, teacher and administrator or administrators, as well as the students. And so everybody's going to kind of be reacting in their own unique way. So the answer to, is on-site professional development available? The answer is yes. We do that, anywhere in the world or whatever. But beyond that, it's the actual professional development itself is custom to what the school or district needs and what they're actually doing. Are they adopting KnowAtom, or are they just trying to wrap their heads around this next generation idea, and so on. And then after that, there tends to be check-ins and looking at student work and educator feedback, and really identifying obstacles, which we then, bring the strategies together to overcome. Now, that's sort of on one side of the spectrum. It goes to the other side of the spectrum too, where we actually can be involved on the ground with PLCs or professional learning communities, whether that's structuring them and helping to participate, really kind of act as a coach in that model. There's also train the trainer kind of models as well. So anyway, professional development really has to be specific to the school or district, and again, it depends on the scale of the school or district. A small school of 100 students is much different than a district of 100,000. But anyway, really great question. Some folks have asked for examples about, let's say a 40-minute video to be able to show an example of teaching a lesson from scratch. And we do have a professional development video available under our resources section. So if you go there, knowatom.com/resources, you should be able to pull up that professional development video. It's a little longer than 40 minutes. What it does is it's going to take you through that 5-step sort of process that you see over here. And it's going to show from the nonfiction reading all the way through. Now, the level it's going to show you is sort of a 4th, 5th grade level. So it's kind of smack in between the little guys and the bigger guys. The video itself is going to be a little bit of a miniature professional development session, because it's going to take that classroom experience and also sort of explain what's happening at different parts. What I will say is that the debriefing and sharing aspect of that is not at full scale, and mainly because we took you through all 5, and to really go through the debrief and share at full scale would have taken another 20 minutes. So nonetheless, but that will get you going. So check out knowatom.com/resources, or you just go to knowatom.com, top of the page, and you can click it and go from there. A couple other questions here. So there's a question that relates to the NGSS, and are they vague? I'm going to pull that slide back up. Let's see here. I would not say that the next generation science standards are vague. They're actually not. They're very specific. The skill in generating curriculum from next generation science standards is to be able to create a context for the standard in the classroom which brings the 3 dimensions together. So they aren't vague in any way. They're actually, in some ways, a little too specific, because what happens is that when you look at a standard like this, developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, the first thing you may think of is that food chain or food web. Well, okay, how do we create a context in which students will experience, not only through sort of reading and getting the common background, and then having discussion, but also really to kind of develop and use this content, and the content being these disciplinary core ideas. So we have to bring the interdependent relationships of ecosystems to life. Okay, so the curriculum has to basically, like you see here, have organisms related in food webs in which some animals eat plants for food and other animals eat the animals and so on. So the context here might be really thinking about ecosystems and marine ecosystems versus the rocky shore ecosystem, for instance. And so in that context, we would have things like fungi and bacteria and all of what you see here. And we have food chains and food webs, not just one, but multiple, and they cross over. And we're going to be able to see the organisms which have to rely on each other in the context of this ecosystem to survive and meet each other's needs. And yet they're forming these food chains and food webs which are transferring energy. And so the matter which they're consuming in energy is being transferred from one organism to the next, and we can see that as the consumers or the primary consumers are consuming producers, so those plants and so on, and how even in an ecosystem, if species disappear, so again, this is having a properly formed curriculum, we can look at as species appear and disappear, that the ecosystem changes over time and the populations change. And so if you have too many predators, the prey becomes scarce and the predators die off. And so we can see these cross-cutting concepts. So now let's take it to the next dimension in this context. We can see the cross-cutting concepts come to life as a system. Okay, and we can describe it in components: producers, consumers, and so on, food chains, food webs, aquatic and non-aquatic organisms, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria. Those are the components, but we can also describe it in terms of a system, an ecosystem, a biome, so on. And in order to access that content, that content and those concepts, we need these science and engineering practices. A student needs to have been able to internalize or be getting the practice internalizing how to develop a model. And in this case, the model is not, the foam planet, sort of arts and crafts model. There may be a foam planet involved. I don't know. But the model that we're talking about here is an intellectual model which describes the phenomena. So if we look at that example that I just gave you, that content, then a student has to be able to look at that and say, oh, hey, look at, these oysters are filtering the water, but they're not just filtering the water, they're filtering the water when they eat. And why are they eating? Because they need to consume energy, they need food, and that food is coming from organisms that are in the water. And so by eating the organism in the water, the oyster is getting energy and it's growing, but at the same time it's providing benefit to other animals and plants by cleaning the water. And so you can see right there that we're describing a phenomenon within an ecosystem using that practice skill, developing a model of how that food chain or food web works, with an oyster. And then science scientific explanations describe the mechanisms for natural events. So you can imagine if we had an overpopulation, or let's say that we had global warmings occurring and the temperature of the water rises, and so the oysters are no longer able to live where they would otherwise live, and so they're not eating the food, they're not cleaning the water. That's a natural mechanism, or in essence, there's some man-made elements perhaps here as well that we have to take into account. But nonetheless, there are mechanisms which are impacting living things, which then may precipitate other things. So for instance, the increase in temperature kills off the oyster. The oyster then is no longer cleaning the water, so the water gets dirty or cloudy or overpopulated with microorganisms and so on. And so as a result of that, other species begin to die and the food chains and food webs start falling apart. Okay, so So that's the role of curriculum. The role of curriculum is to basically bring together these sort of contexts where the practices and the concepts and the systems all sort of are reflected, and the student gets an opportunity to develop and use them, and also sort of a first shot at demonstrating their understanding. And then over time, those contexts and content is going to evolve. And so you can imagine if a student is experiencing science and engineering through this lens and through these different contexts and being in that role of scientist and engineer, then when it comes time for an assessment, they can demonstrate the expectation because, let's face it, they have been demonstrating it all along. They've internalized these practices, and that's where that mastery really comes from. But that's a really great question. And if you would like resources, some other folks have mentioned looking for resources to take to Teams and so on. You're welcome to take this this webinar to Teams as you are doing whatever you need to do to meet your students' needs. And again, thinking about curriculum and instruction, as you move forward in this next generation model, think about it from the learner's perspective. If I had any advice that I would give is really to think from the learner's perspective as really now the classroom is a place where they're going to be experiencing science and engineering by engaging in the practices and really effective STEM instruction, capitalizing on what they know by intentionally inserting content where it's most appropriate and scaffolding those units one after the next. So thank you very much for your time. I won't keep you any longer. If you have a question that we weren't able to get to, feel free to send that along. Otherwise, I wish you luck, and we really hope if there's an opportunity to work with you in the future in some way, whether it's to point you in the right direction or to provide a resource or even the curriculum materials or professional development for you, that you would feel free to reach out. Thank you again, and have a great week. Bye-bye.